and welcome to another historical fiction author chat. And this morning, welcome back to the hotspot, Madeline Martin. Hello, Madeline.
Hello. So lovely to be back here again. Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad you could be here. And we are today talking about the Librarian Spy. Let's talk about that beautiful cover. Look at those two girls.
Thank
Spies.
you. And actually the fun thing is I had the cover posted on Twitter, of course, and a woman reached out and she said, "Hey, that's me." And she was actually one of my cover models. She's the blonde woman on the right. So isn't that so fun?
That's the neatest thing. Do you know what that happened to me with Bluebird? And it was
really?
a woman from Poland, I believe, or the Ukraine, and she popped up on Instagram and said, "Wait, this is me. This is so neat."
That's cool.
Yeah, you'll have to send her a copy of the book.
Oh, yeah, I did. Yeah.
All right. So this morning we're talking about the Librarian Spy, and I will read you first off Madeline's bio and then the synopsis. Here we go. Madeline Martin is a New York Times and international best-selling author of historical fiction and historical romance. She lives in sunny Florida with her two daughters, known collectively as the Minions, one incredibly spoiled cat, and a man so wonderful he's been dubbed Mr. Awesome. She's a diehard history lover who will happily lose herself in research any day, and that is a bond we share for sure. All right. The Librarian Spy. Ava thought her job as a librarian at the Library of Congress would mean a quiet, routine existence. But an unexpected offer from a U.S. military has brought her to Lisbon with a new mission, posing as a librarian while working undercover as a spy gathering intelligence. Meanwhile, in occupied France, Elaine has begun an apprenticeship at a printing press run by members of the resistance. It's a job usually reserved for men, but in the war, those rules have been forgotten. Yet she knows that the Nazis are searching for the press and its printer in order to silence them. As the battle in Europe rages, Ava and Elaine find themselves connecting through coded messages and discovering hope in the face of war. And I haven't gotten to the point where they connect yet, but they're going to make such great friends. It's going to be perfect.
Oh, thank you.
All right. I'm going to disappear here, and I will leave the screen to you.
All right. Thank you. All right. So, Chapter 1, April 1943, Washington, D.C. There was nothing Ava Harper loved more than the smell of old books. The musty scent of aging paper and stale ink took one on a journey through candlelit rooms of manors set amid verdant hills or ancient castles, with turrets that stretched up to the vast unknown heavens. These were tomes once cradled in the spread palms of forefathers, pored over by scholars, devoured by students with a rapacious appetite for learning. And those fragrant yellowed pages were stories of the past and eternal knowledge. It was a fortunate thing indeed she was offered a job in the rare book room at the Library of Congress, where the archaic aroma of history was forever present. She strode through the middle of the three arches to where the neat row of tables ran parallel to one another and carefully gathered a stack of rare books in her arms. They were different sizes and weights, their covers worn and pages uneven at the edges. And yet somehow the pile seemed to fit together like the perfect puzzle. Regardless of the patron who left them after having requested far more than was necessary for an afternoon's perusal. Their eyes were bigger than their brains. It was what her brother Daniel had once proclaimed after Ava groused about the common phenomena, one she herself had been guilty of when he was home on leave. Ever since, the phrase ran through her thoughts on each encounter of an abandoned collection. Not that it was the fault of the patron. The philosophical greats of old couldn't be able to glean that much information in just one afternoon. But she liked the expression regardless, and how it always made her picture Daniel's laughing gaze as he said it. They'd both inherited their mother's moss-green eyes, though Ava's never managed to achieve that same sparkle of mirth so characteristic of her older brother. A glance at her watch confirmed it was almost noon. A knot tightened in her stomach as she recalled her brief chat with Mr. McLeish earlier that day. A meeting with the Librarian of Congress was no regular occurrence, especially when it was followed by a scrawl of an address on a slip of paper and the promise of a new opportunity that would suit her. Whatever it was, she doubted it would fit her better than her position at the rare book room. She absorbed lessons from these ancient texts, which she squeezed out on a whim to aid patrons unearth sought-after information. What could possibly appeal to her more? Ava approached the last table at the right and gently closed La Maison Réglée. The worn leather cover smooth as butter beneath her fingertips. The 17th century book was one of the many gastronomic texts donated by the Catherine Golding Bidding Collection. She had been a marvel of a woman who utilized her knowledge in her roles of the Department of Agriculture and the American Canners Association. Every book had a story, and Ava was their keeper. To leave her place there would be like abandoning children. Robert floated in on his pretentious cloud and surveyed the room with a critical eye. She clicked off the table light and the patron left on lest she be subjected to the sardonic flattening of her coworker's lips. He held out his hand for La Maison Réglée, a look of irritation flickering over his face. I'll put it away. Ava hugged it to her chest. After all, he didn't even read French. He couldn't appreciate it as she did. She returned the tome to its collection. The family reunited once more and left the opulence of the library. The crisp spring DC air embraced her as she caught the streetcar toward the address printed on the Librarian of Congress's own hand. Ava arrived at 2430 East Street Northwest 10 minutes before her appointment, which turned out to be beneficial considering the hoops she had to jump to enter. A stern man whose expression did not alter through their exchange confronted her at the guardhouse upon entry. Apparently, he had no more understanding of the meeting than she. Once finally allowed in, she followed a path toward a large white columned building. Ava snapped the lid on her overactive imagination lest it get the better of her, which it often did, and forced herself onward. After being led through an open entryway and down a hall, she was left to sit in an office possessing no more than a desk and two hard-backed wooden chairs. They made the seats in the rare book room seem comfortable by comparison. Clearly, this was a place meant for interviews. But for what? Ava glanced at her watch. Whoever she was supposed to meet was 10 minutes late. A pang of regret resonated through her at having left her book sitting on her dresser at home. She had only recently started Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca and was immediately drawn into the thrill of a young woman swept into an unexpected romance. Ava's bookmark rested temptingly upon the newly married couple's entrance into Manderley, the estate in Cornwall. The door to the office flew open and a man whisked in wearing a gray, efficient victory suit, single-breasted with narrow lapels and absent any cuffs or pocket flaps, fashioned with as little fabric as possible. He settled behind the desk. I'm Charles Edmonds, secretary to General William Donovan. You're Ava Harper? It was the only the only name familiar of the three was her own. I am. He opened a file, sifting through few papers, and handed her the stack. Sign these. What are they? She skimmed over the pages and was met with legal jargon. Confidentiality agreements. I don't sign anything I haven't read fully. She lifted the pile. The text was drier than the content of some of the more lackluster rare books in the Library of Congress. Regardless, she scoured every word while Mr. Edmonds glared irritably at her, as if he could will her to sign with his eyes. He couldn't, of course. She waited 10 minutes for his arrival. He could wait while she saw what she was getting herself into. Everything indicated she would not share what was discussed in the room about her potential job opportunity. It was nothing all too damning, so she signed, much to the great exhaling impatience of Mr. Edmonds. You speak German and French. He peered at her over a pair of black-rimmed glasses, his brown eyes probing. My father was something of a linguist. I couldn't help but pick them up. A visceral ache stabbed at her chest as a memory surfaced from years ago, her father switching to German in his excitement for an upcoming trip with their mother for their 20-year anniversary. That trip, the one from which her parents never returned. And you've worked with photographing microfilm. Mr. Edmonds lifted his brows. A frown of uncertainty tugged at her lips. When she first started the Library of Congress, her duties had been more in the area of archival than the typical librarian role, as she microfilmed a series of old newspapers that time was slowly eroding. I have, yes. Your government needs you. He stated in a matter-of-fact manner that brooked no argument. You're invited to join the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, under the information gathering program called Interdepartmental Committee for the Acquisition of Foreign Publications. Her mind spun around to make sense of what he'd just said, but her lips flew open to offer her knee-jerk opinion. That's quite the mouthful. IDC for short, he replied without hesitation or humor. It's a covert operation obtaining information from newspapers and texts in neutral countries to help us gather intel on the Nazis. Would I require any training? She asked, unsure how knowing German equipped her to spy on them. You have all the training you need, as I understand it. He began to reassemble the file in front of him. You would go to Lisbon. In Portugal? He paused. It's the only Lisbon of which I'm aware, yes. No doubt she would have to get there by plane. A shiver threatened to squeeze down her spine, but she repressed it. Why am I being recommended for this? Your ability to speak French and German. Mr. Edmonds held up a forefinger. You know how to use microfilm. He ticked off another finger. Fred Kilgore recommends your keen intellect. There went another finger. And that was a name she did recognize. She aided Fred in the prior year when he was microfilming foreign publications for the Harvard University Library. After the months she'd spent doing as much for the Library of Congress, the process had been easy to share, and he had been a quick learner. Excuse me. And you're pretty. Mr. Edmonds sat back in his chair, the final point made. The compliment was unwarranted. The compliment was as unwarranted in such a setting as it was unwelcome. What does my appearance have to do with any of this? He lifted a shoulder. Beauties like yourself get what they want when they want it, except when you scowl like that. He nodded his chin up. You should smile more, dollface. That was about enough. I did not graduate top of my class from Pratt to obtain a much sought-after position at the Library of Congress to be called dollface. She pushed up to standing. And you've got a spine, and you've got steel in that spine, Miss Harper. Mr. Edmonds ticked off the last finger. She opened her mouth to retort, but he continued. We need this information so we know how best to fight the Krauts. The sooner we have these details, the sooner this war will be over. She remained where she stood to listen a little longer. No doubt he knew she would. You have a brother, he went on. Daniel Harper, Staff Sergeant of C Company and 2nd Battalion, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment in the 101st Airborne Division. The Airborne Division. Her brother had run toward the fear of airplanes despite her swearing off of them. That's correct, she said tightly. Daniel would never have been in the Army if it weren't for her. He would be an engineer the way he'd always wanted to be. Mr. Edmonds took off his glasses and met her gaze with his small, naked eyes. Don't you want to see him come home sooner? It was a dirty question meant to slate steep, and it worked. The longer the war continued, the greater Daniel's risk of being killed or wounded. She'd done everything she could to offer aid. When the ration was only voluntary, she had complied long before it became law. She gave blood every few months as soon as she was cleared to do so again. Rather than dance and drink at the Elk Club like her roommates, Ava spent all her spare time at the production corps with the Red Cross, repairing uniforms, rolling bandages, and doing whatever was asked of her to help with the men abroad. She even wore red lipstick on a regular basis, springing for a costly tube of Elizabeth Arden Victory Red, the civilian counterpart to Montezuma Red that servicewomen were issued. Ruby lips were the derisive biting of the thumb in Hitler's war on made-up women. And she would do anything to bite her thumb at that tyrant. Likely, Mr. Edmonds was aware of all of this. You will be doing genuine work in Lisbon that can help bring your brother and all our boys home. Mr. Edmonds got to his feet and held out his hand, a salesman with a silver tongue ready to seal the deal. Are you in? Ava looked at his hand. His fingers were stubby and thick, his nails short and well manicured. I would have to go on an airplane, I'm assuming. You wouldn't have to jump out, he winked. Her greatest fear realized, but Daniel had done far more for her. It was a single plane ride to get to Lisbon, one measly takeoff and landing with a lot of air time in between. The bottoms of her feet tingled and a nauseous swirl dipped in her belly. This was by far the least she could do to help him, as well as every other U.S. service member. Not just the men, but also the women whose roles were often equally as dangerous. She lifted her chin, leveling her own stare right back. Don't ever call me dollface again. You got it, Miss Harper, he replied. She extended her hand toward him and clasped his with a firm grip, the way her father had taught her. I'm in, he grinned. Welcome aboard. A week later, a black Buick came to collect Ava at 8 a.m. sharp for their apartment, from the apartment she shared with the other two my goodness, I'm going to just start over this one section. A week later, a black Buick came to collect Ava at 8 a.m. sharp from the apartment she shared with the two others in Naylor Gardens. The women had thrown something of a goodbye party for her despite how little they knew one another, using the last of their sugar rations to bake her a cake with sunshine yellow roses clustered at the center. It was a kind gesture. She was grateful to know they wouldn't be entirely out of sorts at her abrupt departure. In a city where housing was scarce, they already had someone lined up to take her room. The next day, another government girl in the quintessential white rayon shirt with a pressed convertible collar. Leaving the Library of Congress had been far less easy. Ava had to care. Oops, sorry, we just got a delivery.
No problem.
Leaving the Library of Congress had been far less easy. Ava had cared for those books like they were an extension of herself, coddling and tending to them, ensuring they were loved and cherished. She'd grown accustomed to the beauty of the library, to the feast of learning at her fingertips daily. In the 3 short years she'd been there, she had become a font of information ready to help anyone find anything. She'd always been proud of how necessary she felt. Now she would be venturing into unknown territory, her knowledge limited to a week-long stint of frenzied research. At least with what she had managed to obtain about Lisbon, she discovered the importance of packing several hats, which she would have easily left behind otherwise. Being seen in public in Portugal without one would label her as a prostitute. While she was at it, she used the last of her number 17 ration stamps for a new pair of pumps. With only 4 color options, she chose black over brown, town brown, or army russet. She wore those shoes now with a simple green A-line dress, wraparound skirt, and a white and green rayon blouse. With the busy work over, all that remained was the arduous drive to the airport. A hive of bees seemed to buzz around in Ava's empty stomach. She'd been far too nervous to bother eating anything that morning. "Would you like to see the mall before you go?" The driver met her gaze in the mirror. "The cherry blossoms just bloomed and we have time." The beauty of those trees became diminished in the nation after the horrific attack on Pearl Harbor. 4 had been cut down by vandals, and many demanded that Japan's gesture of goodwill nearly 30 years prior should all be destroyed. In the excitement of preparing to depart for her new role, Ava had not realized the cherry blossoms had bloomed. Ordinarily, it was her favorite time in D.C., even though the accompanying festival had ground to a halt in light of the conservation efforts for the war. "I would," she replied, grateful for his consideration, and a few minutes more of a reprieve from her dreaded flight. "Thank you." The driver turned left and snaked along at 35 miles per hour. The driver turned left and snaked along at the 35 miles per hour enforced speed limit, victory speed, of course, to conserve gas. At last, the mall came into view. It didn't inspire awe as it once did, its pristine appearance marred by rows of temporary housing units and offices for government girls, with anti-aircraft guns sprinkled around the monuments. But the cherry trees were laden with pink petals so heavy that they sifted away to float on the air and dance across the water of the tidal basin, like thick, soft snowflakes. How Ava loved to stroll down the path beneath those trees, letting the flowers whisper across her cheeks as they tumbled gracefully downward on an unseen breeze. It was precisely the distraction that she needed to pull her from her thoughts. It was precisely the distraction she had needed to pull her thoughts from the upcoming plane ride and the trepidation of facing a place she knew too little of. Truly, she wasn't sure what was worse, at least not until she joined the line on the runway to board the plane and her nerves vibrated to an insistent hum. Flying on the plane was far, far worse.
Yay!
Everyone. And I also very much appreciate narrators so much more after I have to read after reading through the piece.
You know, it's so hard to read out loud, and
Hard.
and for some reason it's hardest to read your own, because I like to read when I'm just in the early stages. I read to my husband, and I trip all over the place. It's so hard.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
this is your first reading, right?
It is, yeah. To be honest with you, I also usually, aside from doing like this with you, I usually won't ever even read any of my work because I'll just start editing everything in my head. Like, oh, I could have rewritten this and I could have rewritten this better and turning things around. And yeah.
That's so true. You know, I think people don't understand the depth of editing and how it takes over our lives. You write like a sentence, and it's a beautiful sentence. And then you read it out loud and you think, no, actually, we should rearrange absolutely every word in that sentence. It's quite a job.
Oh, it is, yeah. And at some point, you finally just have to be like, I'm not editing anymore. I'm just going to turn it in, and it is what it is.
Exactly. It's a labor of love.
It is, yes. And then in the galley phase, you're like, please stop editing this book. Please just let us know it's okay so we can go to print.
Yes, exactly. Oh, it's tough doing that. And how many books have you put out now?
I honestly think I may be at about 40 books now.
So. And it still happens. So if you're wondering how stressful it is to be an author, there you go. Because that's a lot of edits. That's a lot of biting. I don't know about you, but biting your fingernails and worrying about all the words.
Yeah, definitely. That's a lot of 2 and 3 a.m. of waking up in cold sweat and being like,
Well, I love this first chapter because actually, it ties in a lot of ways to what I'm writing at the moment with the OSS, which the Office of Strategic Services, because here in Canada, we had Camp X, which was actually a spy school. So I am so enjoying everything you're talking about. My character won't be doing what yours is doing. She's more into code breaking, but it's fascinating. You know what? So many people think that there are too many World War II novels, right? We're done with World War II. I don't see it. I think there are just so many stories still waiting to be told from all over the world.
Yeah. And even like what you're talking about with your book, I didn't even know that Canada did have that. You know what I mean? So I think that's fascinating. I think it's wonderful that so many different aspects of the war and then the brave contributions of so many people are finally getting a chance to really be brought to light. And I think it's wonderful. So I love World War II stories. So I think we all just get to keep them coming.
Bring them on. And your character also has to sign the Oath of Secrecy. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And think about that. That was on pain of death if they said a word to anybody, because it would be treason. So the cool thing about what you wrote in the Librarian Spy and what I'm working on now is that some of these secrets have just come out because that oath is finished finally. So fascinating stuff. So this one, an American librarian drafted into working as a spy with U.S. intelligence and a French resistance member. All right, now you have to tell me your inspiration for this. You've got 80 books. It must be so hard to find inspiration. Where did this one come from?
Well, this particular one actually came from the IDC, the librarians that were actually sent from America into neutral zones in Europe to do reconnaissance, really to get like foreign publications and everything to send back for America to, just look around and see what they can find. Like, it's really interesting, like, when you think about the intel that they would do, like, for example, in the Warsaw Ghetto at one point, they were told to collect all of the fur coats from all of the people who were in the ghetto, like all the Jews who were in the ghetto. Well, it's because they were actually planning on invading Russia. And so they were gathering all those furs. So things that you wouldn't even think would really even, be something like that really ends up being incredibly important as far as strategy and everything goes. So that's one part of the inspiration. The other part of the inspiration came from a real woman who existed in the French Resistance. She worked with the underground press, and she, it's interesting because Lyon, France, it was the capital of the French Resistance, but way back in the Renaissance days, it was also the capital of the printing, like all the printing and everything. Mm-hmm. So there were no shortage of people to write the articles, but there weren't a lot of people who knew exactly how to man them. And the ones who did were, in fact, men. And so the fact that she was a woman apprenticing in this position was incredibly rare. So,
yeah. And there were so many. Yeah, there's so many opportunities for women just sort of sprouting up all over this war. I know that in the beginning of war, here's another aspect that I'm writing about. We're not here to talk about my book, but just tell you, because one of the aspects is...
I think it's all fascinating. I love it.
It's just neat because there's so many aspects of it. And now that we're talking about the OSS, there's more aspects of just that little division of it. My other aspect is the Air Transport Authority, which they used to fly in replacement planes for the downed and damaged planes that, they need replacements. And it started off, they would use pilots from World War I. Some of them, they'd all be pretty much retired. Some of them would be missing limbs, actually.
Oh, wow.
And they put off bringing in the women for so long. They just assumed that the women could not handle any of this stuff. And then, of course, the women stepped in and shortened the war by years. That's
right.
That's so great.
Yeah. In fact, to be honest with you, it very much was an advantage. Like, especially like, for example, the French Resistance, the German soldiers didn't expect these little French women with their high fashion and everything to be, spies. Yeah. Like transporting things and they had these shopping baskets that they always had because unfortunately there was just no food. You could have the ration coupons, but it didn't mean you would have food to get them, you have food to exchange for them. But so these French women always had like these little shopping baskets with them everywhere they went, because you never knew when some random food may end up showing up and you wanted to get it right then and there, as much as you could carry in your shopping basket. And so, these all had false bottoms for a lot of the French resistance women. And nobody suspected a thing because everybody always had their shopping baskets.
That's so neat. I love that. Yeah, you read about that. They look in the bag. Okay, move on, move along. That's good.
Exactly. It's just groceries. It's fine. With like explosives underneath.
You got to admire those women for all that courage back then. In a time when really,
absolutely,
you were supposed to stay home and have babies, and that was pretty much it. And now you are out saving the world. So that took a lot.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, in the very beginning, when France was initially taken by the Nazis, you had Pétain that was in there, and he was basically like telling women that it was their fault for not having had enough men to protect their country and everything. And so you had these like sort of Vichy mentality where these women, they had to procreate as much as possible. And their job was to stay home and do the home and hearth and everything while the men were out, fighting and doing everything. And so, these women a lot of times were actually looked down upon for having not had children and or continuing to have tons of children and everything.
Did you find, when you were researching, did you find it difficult to find stuff about them? I'm finding a lot of the women didn't really put out, like the men would write books about their experiences and they would do interviews and everything, but the women didn't really share too much in what I'm reading in both wars. I find that fascinating. Did you find that when you were researching?
Absolutely, yeah. I will say that like a lot of what I've read about, like with the French women, I've read either interviews that were done with them after the war where they were basically like asked to give that information, or sometimes they were even statements that were given after the war. Like, for example, the woman who inspired Elaine Rousseau's character had actually given this like 15-page typed statement just about like her role in the war. And it was a very like black and white, like we did this. It wasn't like, and then I rushed in and saved the whole room, kind of like, no offense to guys who may be watching this, but how some of the men sort of did. Yeah. But, one of the recurring things I noticed in a lot of what these women were talking about in their interviews is they would just kind of shrug their shoulders and be like, I just did what anybody would do, or I just did my part. Or, for them, they looked at it as just like, when you're sick and your babies are hungry, you still have to get up and feed them. Like that was, that's how they looked at it, almost that sort of same vein.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to talk about your use of books because, the last bookshop in London, then Librarian Spy, and I know the next one is The Keeper of Hidden Books. Is that still the title? Book, which is fantastic. So would you consider these three a series? Everyone wants to know, do I have to read them in a particular order?
Absolutely not. They're completely different characters. There's no correlation whatsoever, aside from just the fact that I am a bookish person who loves books and is writing, incorporating books because it's my favorite thing. But yeah, so they're like, even with The Keeper of Hidden Books, that's set in Warsaw, Poland. So it's all completely different. So.
Yeah. There's such a beautiful trend out of seeing books with covers that have books on them, and yours, no exception. I thought that was so beautiful. I said to my publishers, I want something pretty. I want like that. All the covers are beautiful, but
although you always have beautiful covers too. Bluebird was really just stunning.
Aren't the colors pretty?
Oh, they just popped.
But I like the way there's like the two of them. Like my next book are sisters. It'd be kind of fun to have like these friends.
Oh yeah, that would be awesome.
We shall see, right? Well, thank you very much. This comes out July 26th. Is that right? Yes. But of course, if you haven't pre-ordered it already, that's always an option, a good option to support your favorite authors. Thank you so much for being here, Madeline. It's so good to see you again.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much again for having me back. And thank you to everyone who listened to me, especially, I know I got through some staggering parts there, trying to get through reading it properly. So thank you for hanging in there.
It was great to have you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your summer.
Thank you so much. You too.
Bye for now.